Have you ever been in a place where you've wanted to hide, where you've wanted to not be seen, even if it's kind of a very public place that you are in and you don't want anyone really to know that you are there, maybe hide there along the walls? I think we all have probably been there at different points in time, and I think one of the times where I have noticed this the most was you all have heard me talk about my time in show choir and choirs and music stuff when I was in high school and college, and one of the times I would really notice this a lot was when we go to show choir competitions. And often, like if you've ever been to any sort of tournament, you know how that goes, where oftentimes you spend a lot of time watching other games, especially if you get there earlier in the day. And so we would watch a lot of other choirs, and we'd see some of them come up, and I could pick out those guys. Sometimes it wouldn't take me more than 2 seconds, oftentimes less than that, to pick them out. And these are the guys that you can tell. Hold on, let me drop something real quick. These are the guys that you could tell really were not sure about being there that day. Didn't want to be seen there on stage with anyone else, and you could pick them out because in the middle of a whole bunch of either other people that had great big expressive faces and hands and were really energetic and they were really into their dancing and singing and all of that, there are these guys in the middle of that who are their hands don't get past here. Their fingers kind of get out. They're trying to make themselves as small as possible. And often, at the same time, while they're trying not to be seen, they are also very worried about getting all of their steps right. So they're looking down at their feet, making sure that they're doing all of the right things. So they're hunched over a little bit even. It's easy to pick them out, right? It's easy to pick those folks out in that moment because they're trying so hard not to be seen. Now, at some competitions, there would be enough time in between performances that one of the judges would have time to come up and offer a small clinic to these groups that would often help them to do better or maybe to think about something differently so they're getting more of the impact that they're looking for, just kind of help them improve in different spots. Clinics were great. I loved when we could have a good clinic. And whenever a choir would have, some of these guys that were typically, they were really guys, up there on stage, and especially if there were many of them, some of the first advice that these judges would give to them would be just simply to look up. Tell them, look up out at your audience, look up a little bit, helping them to kind of get out of themselves a little bit. Now, it took me a while before I realized just how important this advice was to look up. Because for a long time, I didn't think it was very good advice, but as I've gotten older, I've realized this is key to a lot of who we are. That when we get so focused in on ourselves that just being told to look up can completely change our perspective on what we're doing. We worry less about what we're doing and more about actually being able to do it and to live fully in that moment, because that's really the key. That's what they were wanting them to do, was to fully live in that moment that they found themselves so that they could really do what was most important. And this is, in fact, the place where we find ourselves as we come into a story about a man found in John's Gospel called Nicodemus. Nicodemus was one of those guys. Now, Nicodemus came to Jesus. This is in John chapter 3. Comes to Jesus in the cover of night because Nicodemus is a Pharisee. A Pharisee in that time could not be seen meeting with Jesus. That was just something that was not going to be done. And so he comes in the cover of night because he sees something in Jesus that's really important, but he also knows that he can't really go to Jesus in broad daylight. And so he comes to Jesus at night, and they begin to talk together with one another, and they begin to have this conversation. And if you know anything at all about John's Gospel, you know that oftentimes that everything Jesus says can have multiple layers of meaning. And sometimes it can be hard to kind of decipher what's going on, or it just takes some extra work because there's so much there to unpack. And so the conversation that Jesus and Nicodemus are having, for anyone else that might be there, might be going a lot over their heads. And in fact, a lot of it was going over Nicodemus's head too. He was struggling with understanding it. And so Jesus gives Nicodemus something to hang his hat on. Remember when we talked about that last week, something to hang your hat on is something that is familiar, that you know, that gives you a context to help you understand the other things, that put you in a comfortable place so you can be open to seeing something new. Jesus is giving him that through a story from Moses' time. And because there are so many stories of Moses' time and so many stories that can be used in this moment, of course, the story that Jesus is telling is one that is about a snake. Like, really? A snake? Who talks about snakes like this? Why is a snake story going to make sense in this context? But it actually is, it's amazingly appropriate for what is needed in this moment. Jesus is using this story, so we need to know a couple of things. One is, why does it fit here? And the second one is where does it come from? So we're going to start with that second one first. That snake story comes from our reading out of the book of Numbers that we had for today. And so we need to kind of recap and remember how we got to this point. Remember that Moses led the people out of slavery in Egypt after all of the plagues, and then they come up to the Red Sea, and Moses parts the waters of the Red Sea so that they can cross over on dry ground to escape Pharaoh and his armies. And then God gives to them 10 commandments for them to live by so that they can learn how to be a nation of people after all of this time that they had spent in slavery, so they can learn how to be that people. God had even sent them food so that they could survive through all of this. So for all of these good things, all of these things that have happened, what is the natural response then of the people to all of this? If you know anything at all about people, then you can probably guess that there was grumbling and there was complaining. They were complaining that they didn't have enough food or water to survive, and then that was awful, and why did Moses take them out of Egypt in the first place? But then literally in the next sentence they're saying that they detested this miserable bread that they had. But didn't they just say they didn't have any food? They're complaining, right? This is what complainers do. I know what my response would be to people like this, and I imagine that maybe some of yours would be very similar, is that I would hear these people, I'd hear what they're saying and how it really doesn't work together, and I would look at them and say, you ungrateful cretins, why are you doing this? And it doesn't really take a whole lot of complainers to spoil the whole thing, right? Just a few of them can have a huge impact in all of this. And so we see what happens next. And so the next part that happens after this is that they are punished for this complaining with poisonous snakes that are biting people. They're starting to kill people. Now, this is something that we can take a look at, and we can take in a couple of different directions. I think both of which add something to the story. I think both of which are important. And the first one is that God, in fact, sent the poisonous snakes onto the people to bite them, and it was going to kill some of them. Remember, we talked about several weeks ago that they lived in a very different world than we did, and so this would have been something they would have been familiar with. Because sometimes, remember, they would wander ultimately in the wilderness for 40 years. All of that time, God is using them to deprogram them from where they had been, and they only get part of the way. Like, it takes a long time for that to work, for that deprogramming to happen. So they're struggling with this, and so sometimes what works is that they get a taste of something like what they had had before, and then God uses that to teach them something different. And so that's one way we can look at what is going on here in this moment, that it is a punishment given to them so that ultimately they can learn a different lesson. Now, another also equally valid way of looking at this would be to say that, you know what happens when you are complaining? Or that happens sometimes if you are around a lot of people that are complaining? You know what you miss? You miss big, obvious signs that maybe you're entering into dangerous territory. Like maybe you're entering, say, into a patch of area that might have a bunch of poisonous snakes in it, so that when you bring a lot of people into that moment and they start trampling around, especially if they're making a lot of loud complaining noises, then you're going to irritate these snakes who are going to start biting people. And then something has to happen in response to that. That is also a valid way of looking at this story. To know that sometimes we can miss big, obvious signs of things that we would otherwise see, except for all of the other things that were blocking us from doing it, that were keeping us from looking up and seeing what was going on. So we've got these complainers. that are really getting in the way. And when people start to die from these snake bites, they're the first ones that go up to Moses saying, "We know that we have sinned and we have done wrong. Save us, Moses, from this trouble that we are in." And so a couple of things. The first one is they knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew that it was bad. They knew that they shouldn't be doing it. Like, they are fessing up to it in the middle of that, but do we really expect any different from complainers? Because again, we have all known some of these people, right? They will complain, but at the first sign of trouble, they're going to be the first ones that are going to admit their mistakes in hopes of that they don't have to suffer the consequences of their actions, right? That if they can just admit and say that they were sorry, that then everything would be okay before any of the consequences would affect them. That's what they're trying to do here, is they're trying to do that. And they're trying to still, even in the middle of that, get their way and get through this. And they kind of succeed in this, only that God is using this as an opportunity to teach the people something different, to teach them something new. And so he says to them, he says, "Go and craft a bronze serpent and put it up on a pole. And then anyone who gets bitten by a poisonous snake, tell them to look up at this pole so that they can survive." Literally, he tells them to look up and live. To look up and live. To break out of that place that you were, to see something different that you hadn't seen before, so that you can live. God is teaching them something new in this time and in this moment. And we see Jesus using this story as a way of helping Nicodemus through what he was facing. This is the same thing that we see those judges from my silly show choir example that I had used before. They were doing the same thing. And not that anyone's life was on the line in a show choir competition, but often we need to be told to look up and live. Living is not just about surviving, but living is also about becoming the fullest person that we can, living to the fullest extent of who we are, being that full and complete person that we can't do if we are doing this, if we're just got little weak-kneed little actions that we're doing. But we need to look up and live. And that if you aren't looking up, then you aren't really living. And then you're going to miss maybe big important things or really big good things that are going on. That was Nicodemus as he was coming into his time with Jesus. That Nicodemus was missing out on things. Now, Nicodemus knew it. That's why he came to Jesus in the first place. So we need to read John chapter 3 with a lot of compassion and empathy on Jesus' part, because he knows that Nicodemus is beginning to understand and he's beginning to get it, but that his role of being a Pharisee is getting in his way. And so he's trying to help Nicodemus to break out of that. And so he's telling them, look up, Nicodemus, look up and live. See something different that you couldn't see before. Get beyond your lists of things that you're trying to do. Get beyond all of the things that were getting in your way that as a Pharisee were a problem, because Pharisees had a lot of problems in that time. For all the good that they did at one point, so much of what they were now was getting them lost. And Jesus is saying, Nicodemus, take a step out. Be different. Nicodemus coming in the cover of night was a first step for him in getting there. But it wouldn't be his last. There's still going to be some more that was going to come that will show us that Nicodemus is figuring this out, that he is learning from all of this. That in the story of the snake that he is told, that it is helping him to see the world in a different place. Where he was caught by his role as Pharisee, Jesus was helping him to find a new path. And we see this come out in John chapter 19. This is the part where Jesus had been crucified. And the next part of the story comes when there are two men who become important at this point. One is Joseph of Arimathea, who goes to Pilate and asks for Jesus' body, and he's got a tomb that he will put Jesus in. And so he takes him down. And the other is Nicodemus, who was identified as the same one who came in the cover of darkness to Jesus. Nicodemus, who helps with this and brings the burial spices that Jesus is going to be buried with. Nicodemus, even though he has watched this happen to Jesus, knows that he is different and that he is beginning a very different journey from this point, because now he has looked up and he has seen the Christ, and he has seen that things can be different. Part of the story of Jesus and Nicodemus in John chapter 3, in the middle of this story where Jesus is saying, "Look up and live," comes the most famous Bible verse of all time, and one that often gets used by itself, but really needs to be paired with the other that comes right after this. This, of course, is John 3:16 and 17. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." Look up and live. If we are going to claim God's promise that he has given to us and that we see come out in so very often through all of Scripture, especially as we enter into a new world that we are still unsure of what it's going to completely look like, we need to look up and to live fully in that moment. If we are going to reset our expectations and renew our faith and restore our lives, then we have to look up and be ready for what God is doing. We can't be like those guys who are trying to hide, even in the midst of being on stage with others. We can't be like the Pharisees of Nicodemus' time, who were working so hard to do the right things that they would miss out on the good that Jesus is doing. We have to look up and live. Remember that in our efforts to hide away, that we will be seen. You can't really hide very well. And sometimes in our desires to do right things, we might miss the good things that are actually happening. So look up and live. We go forward having faith because Jesus came into the world to save it. Comes to the world to save it. This is the promise that we are claiming, that gives us the chance to be who we truly are, to live fully in this moment and in this life as God created us to live, not because we've got it all right, but because we are living fully and completely, because we are looking up and we are living. In a world that has been broken by the year that we have had, helping ourselves and others to live fully is the greatest gift that we can give. And it's only a gift that we can give because we have received it ourselves, because we have looked up and we are living because of it. I invite us to go, to look up, to live, to see God at work in a way that we have never seen before. Go out this week, look up, and live. Amen.